Good morning and welcome to Words That Matter, a modern day book club. I'm your host, Lee Smith. Today we have a very special show. We're going to be speaking about a book, one of the big books of the last century. It's been hailed as one of the major biographies of the 20th century. The author is a man named Robert Caro, and the subject is Robert Moses, the one of the great men of New York State, one of the great men of New York City, and Robert Moses's plans for New York, his design of New York, everything from bridges and tunnels to parks, beach fronts, really was inspirational across the country. And the person that we have speaking about this today is a great figure to talk about this, podcaster, lawyer, and the chairman of Coleman Nation, the culminator. Ladies and gentlemen, you welcome, please, Ron Coleman. Ron, thanks for joining us here today on Words That Matter.
Thank you very much for having me, Lee. I'm glad we were able to put this together. It's very exciting, this project that you have.
Thank you. I think it's really nice because we get to talk about books and we get to give some background on stuff that, will appear in the news, or stuff that's troubling people, or things that people have questions about. And to be able to talk about books, to be able to talk about the history behind something, to really sort of establish the framework and show what's going on, I think it's I think it really sort of fortifies understanding. If we're going to debate these issues, gives people some sort of sense of where we're coming from.
Exactly. We need to understand the world that we're in. Understand the world that we're in before we start reacting. What are we working with? How do we get here, as you said?
No, I think this is very important. We see it all the time. Look, viewers, you'll know Ron. Is very active on social media. Great information, great insight on social media, and social media is very important for the different debates and different information that's shared there. But a lot of the times we see people, friends, very clever people, very important influencers on social media. I was like, look, that's not what happened, right? Having the background to something is actually very important, and I see it all the time, and I'm sure you do too. And so that's really the purpose of the show, to really give some background to the things that people are talking about and sometimes screaming about. Though we try not to scream on Words That Matter. We try to keep it a little calmer.
All right.
Ron,
all right.
it was not. I mean, feel free to scream though if you were so moved. But you were the one, as we were talking about it, when I wanted you to come on and talk, and I said, let's come up with a book to discuss. You're the one who suggested Robert Caro's The Powerbroker, about Robert Moses. And I'm just like, yes, of course. This sounds fantastic. It's not a new book. One was published in 1975, I believe. So nearly half a century old. So why this biography, and why this figure? Why Robert Moses?
The reason this book was my choice, and like you, I got a lot of books. It's the only book that I have, the only secular book that I have two copies of. One in my office, and one in my house. And interestingly, the subtitle is Robert Moses and the Fall of New York, 1974-75. When I first read this book, there was a great irony. Well, you see, Caro was wrong about one thing. New York is back. New York is one of the great resurrection stories in American history and in urban planning history. Guess what? It's 2024. And New York is on its heels again. To answer your question, growing up in New York in the 1960s, I, as a very young child, experienced what is described in this book towards the end of Robert Moses' career, without understanding it. But this man was so phenomenally influential. He is responsible for so much of the structure, the infrastructure, the political structure, the financial structure of how the number one metropolitan economy in America operates, and was never elected to office. And here's the thing, he was brilliant. He had a degree from Yale, which is almost as good as Princeton. He had got 2 degrees from Oxford. He was Secretary of State of the state of New York in his 20s. He was a close associate of Al Smith. Phenomenal. Not only that, he was a reformer. He was so smart, and he rationalized New York government, completely reformed it. But as he got more power, and this is something that's such an incredible lesson and object example for the times we're living in, as people, even with the best of intentions, get power, power and staying in power becomes the only thing that matters. And by the end of his career, although the only person I can think of in world history whose effect on the physical landscape and all that comes with it was as great as Robert Moses, certainly in the 20th century, would have to be Stalin. Now,
Wow.
Robert Moses was no Stalin. He was not a mass murderer, but they both broke a lot of eggs to make a lot of omelets. And a lot of eggs stayed broken.
Well, let me ask you. Well, first of all, where did you grow up in New York? I'm not sure I knew that.
I lived well. Actually, it really is part of the story because I was born in Queens, not far from the for the first couple of years of my life, we lived in Forest Hills, not far at all from the World's Fair that is discussed in this book, and which was the crowning failure of the end of Robert Moses' career. Then we moved to Brooklyn, to the Brighton Beach neighborhood, where that was made famous by Neil. What was his
Simon.
name? Neil Simon.
Neil Simon.
Memoirs, right? I mean, I think Woody Allen may have also. Maybe he was more of a Flatbush guy, but my grandparents lived in Flatbush. And then when I was 9, we joined the Great White Flight in the early 70s when this book was being completed and moved to central New Jersey. And part of what drove us out of that neighborhood was the decline of the city and the decline of the school system. And I won't deny that it was also busing, which was forced integration of public schools, and just a general sense that New York City was not a place to raise a family anymore. So when people ask me, where'd you grow up? I never really quite know what to say, because I think my voice still bespeaks East 12th Street a little bit, but I spent most of my life in New Jersey, which is where I live now.
Well, look, it's very interesting what you say, that pointing out the subtitle of the book, The Fall of New York. And then, of course, we know that New York rebounded spectacularly. But I think, remind me, again, the book's published in 75, but of course you'll remember the famous New York Post headline, right? Ford to NYC, drop dead, which I think was also 1975, right? It may have been 74, but I think it was 75.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was 75. That was, of course, during the Beam administration.
Right.
And New York had not really run out of money then. It had run out of money a long time before. But it was in 1975 when Beam, who was mayor of the city, but ironically had been the controller. It was 1975 when New York could no longer keep cooking the books and moving around assets and playing games. Many of the games of the type that were, Robert Caro would have been very fond of. I'm sorry, Robert Moses would have been very fond of.
Robert Moses, yeah, right.
Well, Robert Caro, I'm sure I appreciated having so much to write about. Could no longer, and yes. So what happened was that the city asked the federal government for a bailout so that they would not default on municipal bonds. And Ford said that, being a Republican, he wasn't going to get the New York vote anyway. And also being a responsible politician, said, I don't think he used the term at the time, but it's what we study economics call moral hazard. Why would we reward you or even reinforce your bad conduct? You've spent money like a drunken sailor for generations. You're going to have to get out of this yourself.
I want to make a distinction, though, between that New York City and the New York City we have now. You know, I mean, we're reading the papers. I was back in New York. I too grew up in New York. I grew up in Manhattan. I was back in the city a couple of weeks ago, and the difference is between the 1970s, I think, and maybe you disagree, but I want to pull Moses into this, is that these people, they didn't want to run New York into the ground. They made lots of mistakes, whether it was Abe Beame, whether it was Robert Moses, whether it was John Lindsay, the different mayors who preceded Beame. But none of them wanted to run this city into the ground the way the people who have been governing this city, at least certainly since Bill de Blasio, have run this city into the ground. And now we see what it's like. That New York has its own profound migrant crisis, its own profound crime crisis. I mean, the crime is insane. The drivers are telling me the reason that there's so much traffic is that no one is taking public transit. No one wants to get on the subway. It's too dangerous. That's intentional. The subways have always been dangerous, but these guys have run it into the ground. So, I mean, do you see that difference between 1970s New York and the 70s, and the New York that Moses is Caro's writing about?
All the difference in the world. All the difference in the world. You're exactly hitting a point that I made recently, which is that everyone agreed we want the city to thrive, and not just that general vanilla statement, but what do we want for the city? A place where families can live and grow up, a place where the streets are safe. Just yesterday, I tweeted something of the Speaker of the House in Albany of the New York legislature is opposing a new law that would increase penalties for assaults on retail workers, which is a gigantic problem in all the blue cities now, because he actually said this. I don't think punishment is a deterrent. Is ever a deterrent. That's like the definition of a deterrent.
Right.
But it's not even, and I don't. You can't. It's like mass insanity. I'm not prepared to say that these numbnuts are sufficiently sophisticated to be Marxists. I think they're just that stupid, and they're just repeating what's being told to them. But you're right. It's all the difference in the world.
What I want to come back to. I want to come back to Robert Caro's book on Robert Moses. So yeah, we're the two Roberts. So, I mean, Caro, and I think you were hinting at this before when you were saying that power affected Moses, but that Caro and a lot of others who have been critical of Moses say that, well, at the beginning of his career, he was an idealist, and we still see all these different things that Moses built. I mean, Jones Beach, right? Jones Beach is it's not a place where I spent an awful lot of time as a kid, but it's a marvelous public beach. So, what happened? You say it was power.
Not only Jones Beach, every way you can drive in and out of New York City, every single major highway, every bridge, over his objection, tunnels he hated tunnels. Now the fact is, it's a driver's nightmare. So many bad decisions were made, but as Eliot Spitzer, the unlamented former governor of New York, said, he got it done. He did get it done. But he, when I refer to breaking eggs, he destroyed neighborhoods. He also, the decisions he made. See, one of his brilliant tricks was getting a hold of money that didn't have to be allocated by legislatures. Early in his career, the way he did that was by building toll bridges and toll roads, and then being the sole person as head of the authorities that were spun off by New York in order. So it's important to understand that when they figured out in New York that nothing is going to get done. I mean, this is one of the things you and I were talking about before is democracy is a very hard way to get anything done. What this book proves is that a complete closing out of democracy is a helpful way to get things done also. You can get things done, but at a lot of human cost. New York realized that in order to, just like in corporate law, we developed the corporation in the 19th century as a way to get things done that couldn't get done with individual liability. In a certain sense, you couldn't get things done in a sophisticated economy if everything had to be voted on and be subject to political interference. Moses was able to take all the money from all the toll roads that got phenomenally large amounts of use, control it, and instead of paying down the bonds that he would issue under New York law, he would take the money from those bonds, take the money from those projects and build more and issue more bonds. So that it became an empire, a phenomenally powerful empire of projects and projects and projects. And as long as he was building projects, he was literally changing the landscape of the earth in a way that only a God can, and affecting the lives of millions of people. He admired, growing up at Oxford, and this is a fairly common thing for not necessarily Jewish, but Americans from, well, he grew up actually rather well off, but Americans with class consciousness if they go to England, they get very, not so much now, I think, but in earlier times, very struck and impressed by the glory and the grandeur of the class system. And he was impressed by the achievements of the British Empire. And the British Empire, the premise of the British Empire was the better race, not quite the master race with a capital M, but we will go around the world and benefit from it economically, but we were also going to improve the lives of the local populace because we're better educated and we're from better stock. And that in and of itself may not have been a false premise, but it was the premise on which he believed he and other gifted people should make decisions for people in the United States. And that's kind of what the problem is.
This is fascinating. We have to cut away for less than a minute. If you're watching on YouTube, please make the jump. Come back with us. Watch us exclusively on Epoch TV. We're in a great conversation with Ron Coleman. And Ron, I'm going to tell you right now how I want to pick it up, because it seems that what you're describing is that Robert Moses, one of the things that he picked up when he was in England was the idea of the British middle class, the British middle classes, and as well as the aristocracy's idea of the white man's burden, having to improve things, having to improve other races as they went around the world in their imperial gambit. We'll be back in less than a minute with the great Ron Coleman. Join us. The world suffers from lack of faith and a transcendent truth. What did you see in 1992?
The fundamental treason that Julian Bonda saw was that they had given up on their vocation to tell the truth. What he saw was that people had now corrupted the task of intellectual life by subordinating it to political passion. I was struck by the fact that back there in the 90s, something similar was happening in our culture under the banner of multiculturalism. Of course, what was odd about the ideology of multiculturalism is that it was actually, there's nothing multi about it. It was always a monocultural animus directed against the then dominant culture of the West. The core idea in the treason of the intellectuals is that intellectuals had given up on their commitment to the idea that we are all in this together, that we share a common humanity. You know, you might come from Europe or Asia or Africa or Detroit or wherever, and you might have this particular ethnic background. And those are real differentiating things, males and females and so on. Still, we share a humanity in common that transcends that. And once you give up on that, you have started down the road to a very divisive ideology.